So, what are the Browns' problems that could ruin their season or could go wrong for the Cleveland Browns this year? I've talked at length about how I feel like this team has a well-constructed roster, but there are some questions about the roster that some people don't really understand right now or understand what the team's thinking when they're going with what they're choosing to go with when it comes to this roster. Said roster a lot there, but the point still remains. It's kind of what we're talking about, right? So what are things that could go wrong for the Browns, and what in those areas where the Browns have left, you could say intentionally weak, what is their plan? Well, let's talk about it. First things first, we're going to talk about the interior defensive line. I think of all the quote-unquote flaws that this team has, I think interior defensive line, outside of one other position, has been probably the most focused on of all of the position groups, because people kind of look at this, and I get it. When we talk about roster and we try to judge each position group, it's hard to judge that by weighing in on the impact that the scheme is going to have on the importance of a given position group, right? In some schemes, like a 3-4, let's just go real basic. A 3-4, technically the most important room is your linebacking room, because that covers edge, that covers interior, that covers everything in there. And there's a little bit more of an importance to your interior defensive line, but your corners, your safeties, they're kind of second fiddle, right? Like, they're not as important in that kind of a defense. You go to a 4-2-5, like the Browns run most of the time. Browns run a lot of nickel. So all of a sudden, the linebackers become de-emphasized. The interior defensive line becomes de-emphasized. It's more about, can you rush, force a pass into tight coverage, and get a turnover that way. Different defenses prioritize different positions. Different schemes prioritize different positions and skill sets. So when we get into this conversation where we're just looking at the roster and going, this position group's good, this position group's good, this position group's good, we're not really factoring in the importance that the scheme places on whatever position group that may or may not be. And this is going to be another thing that comes up with wide receiver. But that's how these things actually work out, right? Where, some position groups aren't going to have as many resources put into them because the scheme dictates that they're not going to be that important. If you're planning on running a ton of 11 personnel, you're probably not going to spend a lot of money on running backs or fullback, because they're never going to be out there. Well, the running back's going to be out there, but they're not going to be asked to carry the load. Vice versa, if you're planning on running a tight end heavy scheme or a Greg Roman style offense, then yeah, you're going to try to make sure that you draft a running back every year just so you can have somebody in here that can carry the load. That being said, why is the Browns' defensive line a weakness? Because there's no clear guy in that defensive line yet, right? I like Perrion Winfrey. Perrion has not played a preseason snap yet. It's hard for me to make a definitive statement on him yet. So before I see him in training camp about what he's going to do year one, I have definitive statements on what he could do throughout his career or what he could become. But year one, immediately, it's hard to judge any player in year one what they're going to be able to contribute, because you just don't know until you know. But that is the case with Perrion. Taven Bryant has been up and down throughout his entire NFL career. Then you got Tommy Togiai, Jordan Elliott. A lot of question marks on this team in the interior defensive line. Now, why did the Browns leave it this way? Well, this is where scheme comes back into the conversation. The Browns would rather be deep at DB, be athletic at linebacker, than be heavy on the inside. And the reason that is because, one, they like to move both Miles and Jadeveon to the inside and out throughout the games multiple times. And two, from a philosophical standpoint, this is where I think the Browns are coming from. If you want to keep the ball closer to Myles Garrett, be my guest. Like, if you think running the ball on the Cleveland Browns is going to be a solution, and you think that keeping the ball close to Myles Garrett, their best player, is the solution to beating the Browns, then Hey, be my guest, right? I think that's the Browns' plan. We know that we have our best player on the defensive line. If you want to keep the ball closer to the line of scrimmage, sure, we'll take that bet, right? Because, yeah, you might get 110 yards rushing in a game. You might even get a touchdown or two. But what the defense will be able to create on enough basis, just because it's just probability when you have a player as good as Miles and you have another guy on the other side, Jadeveon Clowney, who's really good in run stopping. So it's either you run towards Jadeveon, who's a better run defender than Miles, or you run towards Myles Garrett, who's Myles Garrett. So they're going to take that bet, right? Now, if you want to go up the middle, the Browns will pinch. They'll just rely on their edges. So they'll pinch JOK inside. They'll pinch one of their safeties in. And they'll go all in on that middle with smaller players, more personnel, but smaller players. They feel like they're getting gashed there. And then just trust their two Pro Bowl edges to handle that, right? More responsibility to them. Again, having good players at certain positions in certain schemes allows you to get away with less at other positions. It's going to come up when we talk about wide receiver. But that is the plan, right? We have Myles Garrett. If a team decides that they rather keep the ball closer to Myles Garrett and let Myles get into this game more, sure. I think we'll be able to get him behind the sticks enough to force a couple of punts and give the momentum to the offense. So that is a bet they're willing to take. And if you want to drop back and throw a million times, sure. Throw it to Denzel Ward. Throw it to Greg Newsome. But the Browns know that the way that people are looking at this from the outside looking in might not be absolutely correct, where, yeah, if you're looking at this from a depth chart standpoint, you could just run up the middle. But the scheme matters so much when we have these conversations, because you can run up the middle. But what if it's Miles and Jadeveon in the inside and they rotate in? Are you going to change the play call, run back out? Because the Browns have more depth and athleticism in their edge room, so they might be able to still do that, right? JOK, very athletic, so they can still get to the edge even if they put Miles or Jadeveon on the inside. So I don't think this is as big as an issue when you factor in scheme as a lot of people are going to make it out to be. But I do understand the concern, because when you do look at this from a roster standpoint, you look at one position group and you see, none of these guys look like starters, or at least are proven starters yet. The next position that could go wrong, that people are talking about going wrong, and boy, have we heard all the takes about this position, is the quarterback position. I think so much was made to do of nothing with this position. We'll see what happens during the season. I could ultimately be wrong, but I think there's been a great amount of disrespect thrown at Jacoby Brissett in the attempt to prop up Baker Mayfield over the last couple of months that I just don't feel like was earned. Because if you look at the last season, the last full season Jacoby Brissett played in, and you compare that to the same year that Baker Mayfield had in 2019, I'm not even going to throw 2021, right? But let's compare it to 2019. Because the reason I'm using 2019, by the way, is because both Jacoby Brissett played a full season in 2019 and Baker Mayfield played a full season in 2019. That's the only reason I'm using 2019. Jacoby didn't play in 2020, right? So when it comes to Jacoby's numbers here, right, let's look at some of the advanced stuff. And I think Jacoby, he throws the ball for less yards per pass attempts, right? He's definitely not going to take a lot of risk. But he had a better on-target percentage than Baker Mayfield. You see Jacoby at 17, Baker here at 31. Baker was better through less bad throws, but the on-target percentage is something interesting here to know that, right? So you see the difference between these two in that one section. Also, Jacoby Brissett in 2019, you can make the argument that the last time both these players played a full season in the same year, Jacoby Brissett was better. All right, Jacoby Brissett's stat line in 2019, 60.9% passing percentage, was a 7-8 record as a starter, 3,000 yards, 18 touchdowns, 6 interceptions. Not like a spectacular stat line by any means, but that's what he did in his last full season as a starter. And then if we go here and we go turn to Baker Mayfield's 2019, as we are all well aware of. It was much worse, right? Baker 6-10 record, threw for under 60% completion, almost 4,000 yards, but 22 touchdowns, 21 interceptions. You see what I mean, right? So we know that Jacoby Brissett is not as bad as people have wanted to make Jacoby Brissett to be out to, right? Here's the thing with Jacoby. Is he going to be spectacular? No. Is he going to have the same amount of wow throws as Baker Mayfield can provide? Absolutely not. What you're sacrificing with Jacoby Brissett is you're not going to get downfield attacking all the time. He's not going to attack downfield. You're going to have a lot more checkdowns. It's going to be, for better and worse, less entertaining to watch, right? Because he's not going to make a ton of risk. He's not going to make a ton of crazy plays. But what he will do is take less sacks. He will turn the ball over less. And he won't put the ball in danger as much, right? And that was the thing with Jacoby. And Jacoby over his career, I think he has a 3-to-1 touchdown interception ratio. Baker Mayfield has a 5-to-3 touchdown to interception ratio, right? So the ball's going to be in peril less. And I think people misunderstand that when people say this, they're not saying, would I take Baker Mayfield, or would I take Jacoby Brissett in any situation over Jacoby Brissett in any situation? But for the Cleveland Browns situation, where you have a good running attack and you have a strong offensive line, what you need out the quarterback position at a bare minimum is a lot different than what you need for other teams, right? And for the Cleveland Browns, Jacoby Brissett's weaknesses are just less detrimental to this offense than Baker's, right? Jacoby Brissett's weaknesses is that he's not going to attack downfield. He's not going to create big-time throws. He's going to be a pretty, quintessential backup quarterback, right? Just making the safe throws. So you're not going to get the sexy stuff, but you don't necessarily need the sexy stuff with the Browns because you can get 5 yards per carry from your running backs, which means you don't need the big time throws to get the first downs. All you need is a quarterback who's going to be on time, who doesn't get you behind the sticks so you can keep the run game intact and doesn't turn the ball over so a deficit doesn't mount that gets the run game out of there. Baker Mayfield's flaws, on the other hand, were a bad fit for this offense just because the turnovers take the run game out of effect. The sacks take the run game out of effect. When you get behind the sticks, which Baker Mayfield is more prone to do with this Cleveland Browns offense, then it creates a problem, and he wasn't necessarily better at the other stuff to justify it, right? So that is why ultimately I think they were fine with Brissett in there for a year versus Baker Mayfield, because they feel like Brissett's flaws aren't going to hurt the offense as much as Baker's flaws were. Now, when Watson's out there, if he's out there this year, it's obviously a clear upgrade, but the whole Jacoby thing, why people were just disrespecting him when he's had, a relatively good year in the NFL, made no sense to me. And I get, look, Baker had a good year in the NFL in 2020. And I think people have given him the benefit of the doubt since that good year because of that good year. But Jacoby, on the other hand, just got roasted. Like he's never been a decent quarterback in the NFL. When there was a year where Jacoby was a better quarterback than the dude that we were talking about in 2019, just flat out. Browns would have probably won more games if Jacoby was their quarterback in 2019 than Baker Mayfield. Like, that's what the numbers say. A lot of them. So I just don't understand why that got so blown out of proportion. And let's go to the third thing that could become an issue for this team is wide receiver. Now, when you look at the wide receiving room, the reason people think this could become an issue is you see Amari Cooper and a bunch of unproven dudes. Kind of similar to the defensive line, but this is in a better situation. So Amari Cooper, who's been good but not great throughout his NFL career, right? Like, he's never been one of the best wide receivers in the NFL, but he's always been consistently all right, like pretty good, right? 1,000-yard wide receiver, a solid guy. And then you have, a bunch of guys that aren't proven. And again, this is where scheme comes into play. The Browns offense is never going to be one of those offenses. They're going to have multiple, like, they're not going to be the Bengals. where the Bengals go and they have like almost 3 dudes who can get over 1,000 yards in receiving yards a year, that's just not going to be what happens for this team because they prioritize tight ends in the red zone. They prioritize tight ends a lot more than other teams. And wide receivers more of a secondary thought when it comes to how they scheme things up. So the reason the Browns aren't worried about this, even though if you just look at the roster sheet, is because one, they're not expecting that much from their wide receiving core. Two, also, I think they're expecting some young guys to step up. Donovan Peoples-Jones, they're expecting him to step up. And David Bell, I think they're expecting him to step up too. The real risk in that is, hey, if none of those guys step up, then you're in a problem. But that's where trading for Deshaun Watson comes in. If Watson plays, you feel confident, just like how Myles Garrett covers up holes on your defensive line because Myles is a top level player at his position. You're hoping that Deshaun Watson, being, in a lot of people's opinion, a top 7 quarterback, covers up the flaws of the wide receiving room because he's able to just get the ball in the right place. And he has demonstrated that he can do that throughout his career. So that's what I think the Browns are thinking. These are the holes on the Cleveland Browns offense, or the Cleveland Browns team, that people have been talking about a lot. This is why I think they could be a problem, and also, on the other hand, why I think the Browns don't believe these things to be that big of an issue. But that's my thoughts on that. Let me know what you think in the comment section below. Y'all have a great day. Have a good night.